Cheers, peeps. Let's talk International Booker Shortlist, shall we? And while we're talking about it, let's drink a coffee. It is really good. Decaf Texas turtle coffee with caramel macchiato oat creamer. And that is a good combo. I found it at World Market today and thought I would give it a shot. So, International Booker. I have a book, I have some notes, and I have my phone because there's a lot of information about these books. I think, and I don't want to hype it up too much because it's not perfect, but this was by far one of the best prize lists I've ever read. I had such a great time. I did have a DNF. There's definitely like a hierarchy of what I like the best, but for the most part, I think a lot of these books were absolutely incredible, and I'm really impressed with the International Booker this year. I last year only read a couple of the books. Most of them I couldn't even get my hands on for some reason, but this year I was able to get the entire shortlist, and I was able to get it in a fairly reasonable amount of time. So I'm gonna say, before we get going, if you want any information about any of these books, the Booker website is actually an incredibly good resource. They have reading guides for every book. They have interviews with the author. They have all what the critics are saying in the quotes and the synopses, and it's just a wonderful resource for learning more about any particular book that you have more interest in or would like to know more about. I have been on that website. It's gotten to the point now where when I type it in, I get a little bubble that says, "You've been here multiple times." So that's how often I've been using it as a resource. I'm going to try to be as minimal as possible with each of these books. I'm not going to go super far into detail, but I'm going to talk about my general thoughts and what each book is about and how I felt about them. I think it should be a good time. Let's start with the one that I actually have physically with me, and that is Not a River by Selva Almada, translated from the Spanish by Annie McDermott. So, the first thing I want to note about this particular edition, and I don't know why this has happened or what the reasoning is, but there is no translator note in this. And apparently there should be, because other versions of the book come with a translator note. Again, I'm not really sure why it would not be in this book, but I do feel like it gives a disservice to this book because apparently the translator notes do talk a lot about the formatting of this book. And you will notice that this formatting in the book is different, and I think it would make more sense if you could read about what the translator's thought process was behind this. It has something to do with it flowing like a river, and I think that there is some validity to that. So I'm trying to give you an example. Okay, so here's one, and I'm gonna hope don't read too closely if you don't want spoilers because it's near the end of the book. So you'll have, "Can we get a beer?" says the character, and so that's how there's no quotations. It's done like that. It's almost poetic in a way, and I think that does in fact link into my reading experience with this, which was it felt kind of like a fever dream, a bit of these sequences that when you're dreaming, you're like, how do these connect? Like they're just so random, and that's how I felt about reading this book. It's really weird because I enjoyed reading. I enjoyed the reading process of this, but I don't know that I understood the story entirely, and I find that to be really interesting coming out of it. So you're following three characters. Two of them are a little bit older, and one of them is the godson. And the Tito, what is his name? Tilo, his father has passed away, and he was friends with the other two men. And this starts with like a fishing sequence with a stingray, and things kind of spiral from there, and it seems like a weird spot to start a story. And in a sense I agree with that because I didn't really understand the significance of the stingray so much, and I think that's where for me the enjoyment of the book fell off a little because I wasn't really understanding the message. And while I've heard a lot of people really enjoying this book, for me it fell a little flat. I thought, like I said, I read it, it's very short, and I thought the reading process was good, but the overall story I didn't totally understand. So you're following these three characters and then also the points of view of these two girls, these sisters, and you see how they come into each other's lives and your past and your present, and it's, like I said, a bit of a weird dream-like book. And I think that that's the point, because when I felt that way and I started to read what the critics were saying about it, a lot of them did use dream as a way to describe what the reading experience of this was. And I would totally agree. I probably would suggest looking for a couple other people's reviews on this book. I have seen it run the gambit. Gretchen at Made You Book enjoyed this book, and Charlotte at, is her name Charlotte? I don't know what her channel is called. She hated it. So it has definitely, it's all over the spectrum in terms of enjoyment. I'm very much in the middle. It is like a loose third in a trilogy. I don't know where the connection is, but I didn't know that when I read it, and I didn't feel like it needed anything else because I didn't find out it was part of a trilogy till after, and I don't feel like I was missing anything, unlike, you know, the book from Women's Prize where you find out it's part of a series and you absolutely felt like you were missing something. This did not do that for me. So I enjoyed this book, but wasn't my favorite, and I'm not totally sure what the story was, but it was an interesting read nonetheless. Let's break for coffee. Okay, let's talk about the DNF, and that was Mater 210 by Hwang Sok Young, and this was translated from the Korean by Sarah Kim Russell and Youngjae Josephine Bae. So this I DNF'd quite quickly. You're starting with a man who is protesting, he's doing a sit-in on top of this crane because he's protesting unfair, unjust layoffs. And so this is a generational saga, three generations in Korea. It starts with the Japanese occupation and goes through to the 21st century. So it runs quite a long span of time. And I think you're following kind of this working class, not even working class, but this family of workers and the political upheaval that goes along with it. And I think you're kind of getting the story told through the point of view of the man who is sitting on top of the crane. For me, I just could not get engaged with the story. I think the writing was okay, but there was something about the tone and the pace and just the overall vibe. That's such a surface level word to use for this book that I couldn't find myself getting into. I haven't heard anybody else talk about this book, so I don't know what the overall kind of feeling is about it. But what I did find interesting is when I finished reading it, I went back and I was reading things that the critics were saying and what the Booker Prize judges were saying about this book, and they made it sound so good. Like, they made it sound like it was such an incredible piece of literature. And so I actually did give it a second chance. I went back and I was like, okay, maybe I just wasn't in the right frame of mind for this book. And I did go back and try to read more of it, and it just wasn't working for me, and that's unfortunate because apparently it's a pretty profound novel about a time and a place that isn't super well known. This author, I think, in his real life has really come up against some political hardships. I believe he was in prison for 5 years, and because he couldn't write in prison, this is where all of his ideas for his stories came from. It's an absolutely fascinating thing. I'm really sad that this book didn't work for me, but I would say if you like Korean history and you like multi-generational family dramas, and this kind of look at the worker and what they're doing to fight back against injustice appeals to you, you may want to still give it a go. It just wasn't for me, but I think if you were to look at the website and see what the critics are saying, you would see why I gave it a second chance. Just the praise that was coming out for this book was top-notch, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. So I wouldn't take my experience on this book as the be-all end-all. I would just say it wasn't exactly for me. Don't feel bad if it isn't for you either, but maybe give it a shot. Actually, before we leave Mater 210, another really quick note is the translator note was fascinating for this book. just in terms of what can and can't really be translated into English, and what you lose when you do translate a word, and how the translators really grappled with making sure they stayed true to the original intent of the book, while being able to make it work for English audiences. I found it to be fascinating, which is why I was upset that the translator note is not in this version of this book, because the translator note in Mater 210 was another reason why I was actually really excited to read this book, because the way they were talking about the translation process was absolutely fascinating. And if nothing else, read the translator notes on this book, because I think you will learn a lot about what it is to translate a book from a language to another language when there aren't necessarily parallels for everything that's being said. Absolutely fascinating. We then have Crooked Plow by Itamar Vieira Jr., and this was translated from the Portuguese by Johnny Lorenz. I finished this book yesterday, and in this book you're following two siblings. Are they twins? I can't remember if they're twins or not. I think they might just be an older and a younger sister, but I could be wrong with that. And you're following these two siblings. They find a knife, and something happens with this knife, and it kind of changes the trajectory of their lives a little bit, and even those around them. This knife belongs to the grandmother, the Donana, I think is maybe what she's called, and when she sees what happens to her grandchildren because of this knife, it also impacts her as well. And so this book is broken up into three parts. You're following both the sisters, and in the third part, you're following kind of this spirit that flits from character to character, and you start in third person or first person and you go to second person. It's a really interesting transition in the way the story is told and in the points of view you get. And it's about these people who are growing up in this land, and due to a colonial past and slavery, they're on land that they're allowed to work, but everything really belongs to the landowner. And the landowner allows them to build homes, but they can only use mud. And so they're never able to really establish themselves. And unions come into play, and kind of what it is to want to fight for more of your resources. And it was a really interesting look at the history of that area. I thought it was quite good. This was a very slow build book for me. At one point I did think, oh, I don't know if I'm going to finish this, but I persevered. I kept going, because again, it's a fairly short book. It was only 200 something pages on my e-reader, so physically that's probably 100 something pages. And I'm glad I pushed through, because I think the story really built over time when you began to see these characters develop and see their points of view shape and the world around them change and what they were going to do to fight the system they were in. There's a really interesting look at one of the sisters who goes to live with a man and how that really impacts her life. And I enjoyed it more than I initially thought I would. It was a book that's been on my radar for a while. I have heard of it. It was one that I wanted to pick up, and so when it was shortlisted, I was glad, because I was finally able to get my hands on it and read it. I'm not sure that it would have been prioritized on my TBR otherwise, but I did enjoy it. I do think that there's a blurb where it talks about the synopsis makes it seem a little bit more dramatic than it is, and I think that's kind of where my expectations and reality clashed a little bit. But ultimately I enjoyed it. The writing was really good, and I'm glad that I read it. Again, it's a book that's got a lot of history about a place that I don't know much about, and I think it was done quite well. So those were the three that I feel okay about. But these next three, I really, really, really enjoyed reading these books. I thought they were all incredibly good reading experiences. One is definitely like high tier, and the other ones are slightly below. But like I said, and these were the three that I started with. So my start of reading through this shortlist was really great, and I was having a wonderful time. And as I said, I think it's possibly one of the best shortlists I've read ever. Not that I've read a ton, like, let's be honest, but I had a really good time with these. And so one of the three that I absolutely loved was What I'd Rather Not Think About by Jenta Postuma, and it's translated from the Dutch by Sarah Timmer Harvey. And this book follows a set of twins. You never get their names. They're referred to as 1 and 2 because 1, the male, was born first, and he always just refers to them as 1 and 2. And 1 is depressed, and it's about the look at this relationship between these siblings when one of them doesn't necessarily want to be alive anymore. And there are some really poignant quotes and talks. And he talks about, I can't remember the quote exactly, but it was something about how, why am I sick? Like, why isn't life the thing that's considered sick? Because he's just really struggling with wanting to be there anymore. And it follows the story, and it's fascinating because their relationship is so messy. It's a sibling relationship that goes through so many peaks and valleys, and at some points you're like, do they even like each other? Like, there's so much conflict, but they're so codependent, and they rely on each other so heavily. And I really enjoyed it. I just thought the writing was really great. I thought the point of view was really great. I think there were moments that were funny, but it's still a very serious topic matter, obviously, because, you know, it is about suicide and suicide ideation and what it is to be with somebody who you're trying to pull back. And, like, you know, the sister talks about how she would give absolutely anything to save her brother from these thoughts and these feelings, and yet there's nothing she can do. It's got to be from him. And it's just, it was so well done, cleverly done, respectfully done, and I loved reading this book. I thought it was so good. It's also interesting that the main characters aren't named, but everybody else has a name, except maybe the mother. But, like, the therapist has a name, and the boyfriend has a name, and the husbands have a name. Like, they all have names except for the 2 main characters, and I thought that was interesting. I don't know what the point of choosing that in your writing would be, but I thought it was kind of cool. We then have The Details by Aya Genberg. This is translated from the Swedish by Kira Josefsson. And this is split into 4 parts. And you're following one woman, and she starts the book kind of in this fever, not kind of, she's in a fever. And it sounds very much like she's suffering through COVID. And it's split into 4 parts, and she talks about a person in each section, like an ex and a best friend, and I can't remember the other 2, but each person has played a really important role in her life, whether they are still in her life or not. And I know there's some talk about, it's about your story being told by other people, and, like, who has the right to that story. Like, is it you as your story, or is it the person and what they're perceiving from you? I am not gonna lie, I probably wouldn't necessarily have gotten that if I hadn't been told that that's something that the book was doing. For me, I was just reading it for the story, and I thought the story was great. I thought her relationships, all of her relationships, were so unique, and I thought her personality came out in every relationship in different ways, but in believable ways, in ways that, you know, you change around certain people. And I just thought the writing was absolutely exceptional. This was another book that surprised me. I think all of these books surprised me because the Booker Prize, if you've been around, you know the Booker Prize and I did not get along well last year. And even the International Booker last year, the few that I read, they were a little ho-hum. So going into this one, I was just immediately drawn into the writing of this book. The pace of this book, the tone of the book, everything about it worked for me. Again, short. That's another thing I really liked about this list, is a lot of the books were quite small. And this was no exception. I really enjoyed it, and would definitely say, if you like kind of more character study books than plot books, this is one that you should absolutely check out. And then, if you know the shortlist, you know what I'm talking about. Last but not least, in fact, last but best, is Kyros by Jenny Erpenbeck, translated from the German by Michael Hoffman. This book is elite in every way. The writing is some of the best writing I've ever read. The storytelling is incredible. The characters are so well developed. The tone is immaculate. The dialogue is great. The political background is done so well. Honestly, I am absolutely floored by the level of brilliance that this book brought to the table. And it's because of books like this that makes me look at other book prizes and think, how did you choose your list? Because there's such brilliance out there, and yet that's what you chose for your list, and this is the short list for this particular prize. And like, they knocked it out of the park with this one. It is about a relationship between a man and a woman. The woman is 19, the man is in his 50s, I think. There's a 34-year age difference, and that does become a problem. There's a lot of, it kind of starts out as like, you think it's almost a sweet relationship, sort of. There's cheating, like right off the bat. There's definitely infidelity in this book. And then it gets very messy with the power dynamics and the manipulation, but these relationships, the relationship between the couple is almost secondary to, you're looking at them as people, as individuals, and what they're going through and how they're thinking and what their lives look like, and dealing with the repercussions of the fall of the Berlin Wall and what it's like before the wall falls and then after the wall falls. And it's fascinating because when I read about this book, I heard that it got political, but I would say the politics really don't come in until the back half of the book, and by then you're so engrossed in these characters that the political upheaval and what the characters need to go to starts to make sense, because you've established a relationship with these characters and you understand more how they look at the world. And then this whole new thing comes in from the West. Like, they talk about how all of a sudden Coke is available, the Coca-Cola, the drink Coke, and what that does to them. And I just thought it was absolutely spectacular. It is a book that I think is probably going to be in my best books of the year. It's a book that I absolutely want to own and read again. I cannot tell you enough how much I love this book. The writing was incredible. The author did a really interesting thing where occasionally you would get repetition, but it would be for one sentence. Like, your point of view would just change for one sentence, and it was fascinating how flawlessly that was done. And that's also obviously credit to the translator, who was able to take the author's original work and create that seamlessness. I could rave about this for a while. I'm not going to rave about it anymore. I'm just going to tell you that if you're thinking about reading the International Booker Shortlist, there are some absolutely incredible works on this list. Go check them out. Even if the one that you're most interested in is one that wasn't my favorite, go read it, because I was totally blown away by this shortlist, and I'm so thrilled that I was able to get my hands on all of them and found some just incredible pieces of literature. So that is it. Final drink of coffee. Seriously, this is so good. I'm going to edit this, get it up. It's been a couple weeks since I posted because, you know, life, but I'm stoked that you are here. If you are still here and you were even a little bit interested in this, maybe hit the subscribe button, check out a few more, and I will see you, I don't know, in the next one.